They called it madness. In the wide-open heart of Texas, billionaire horse breeder Richard Stanton hurled a dare that shook the dust from every ranch. $5 million to any soul, reckless enough to stay on his black demon of a stallion Leviathan for 2 minutes. Cowboys came, cowboys fell. Bones cracked, pride shattered. Ambulances carried the unlucky away, and whispers spread faster than wildfire. No man could last. Yet from the edge of the arena's shadows, a figure rose, a war veteran, forgotten by fortune, dragging nothing but scars, silence, and a courage unpurchased by gold. He didn't step forward for the money. He stepped forward because sometimes a man's fight isn't with the beast in front of him, but the ghosts behind him. And so, the wager transformed. It wasn't just man against horse. It was survival against oblivion, reckoning against ruin. The story carried into a bar on Amarillo's cracked streets, where neon buzzed weakly against the night. Inside, the air was thick smoke, sweat, and the hum of anticipation. Ranch hands, oil-field roughnecks, weathered cowboys, all packed shoulder to shoulder, voices colliding beneath the tired drone of a jukebox. Every lip spoke the same name, Stanton. Every whisper circled the same monster, Leviathan. 5 million cash, one man barked, slapping his palm against scarred wood. All you gotta do is sit that devil for 2 damn minutes. Laughter, whistles, a curse or two spat into the haze. To men who scraped wages from sunburn and broken backs, the sum was unholy enough to buy freedom, enough to tempt fate. But no one in that bar believed Stanton's game was about money. They knew him cruel, not generous. He didn't want a victor, he wanted blood. The radio repeated the dare. The news flashed it across diners and truck stops. And still, the whispers deepened, laced with dread. Because they all knew what came next. Someone was going to try, and someone was going to bleed. They spoke of Leviathan not as a horse, but a nightmare born of muscle and fire, stitched together from rage itself. And then, just as the laughter cut sharp, a silence fell. The bar door creaked open. Cigarette smoke curled as every head turned. The war veteran stood there in the doorway, not drunk, not smiling, just waiting. And for the first time that night, the room understood. The story was about to change. Stanton's prize stallion, cold black and massive, weighing in at more than 1,700 lb. A mountain with hooves, a beast with eyes like burning coals, and a temper no reins could hold. Stories circled like whiskey rounds. Bucked a man clear over the rail last month, shattered his ribs, broke another cowboy's arm in 3 places, and you hear about Tom Riley tried to work him in the pin. They say Leviathan stomped him dead before anyone could drag him out. Each telling grew darker and more monstrous until Leviathan no longer resembled a horse at all, but a demon, loosed from the dirt of Texas. Some swore you could see the whites of his eyes roll like a storm when he struck. Others whispered he was cursed. Stanton's personal devil kept angry by design, and yet the promise of money made men wonder. If Leviathan could be ridden, even for 2 minutes, he might turn from demon into gold mine. That was Stanton's lure, and it worked. Every soul in the bar was hooked. In the back corner, away from the laughter and smoke, sat a man no one bothered to toast with. Jack Callahan hunched over a chipped glass, the amber of cheap whiskey catching the low light. His jacket, once army green, had faded to a tired brown. The boots on his feet were scuffed down to soft leather, the kind a soldier wore, until they became second skin. His hair, once dark, had silver streaks that came too early, like snow in autumn. Lines cut deep into his face, not the lines of age, but of sand grit and 5 nights without sleep. His shoulders carried a weight heavier than any saddle memories of places no one here would ever see. Guy fought overseas. One barfly, muttered, nodding toward the corner. Iraq, maybe Afghanistan. And came back busted up. Now he lives off scraps. VA check ain't enough to keep the lights on. Jack didn't flinch. He had heard the whispers before. He didn't need their pity nor their judgment. His drink was cheap because that was what he could afford. But the silence around him was his by choice. He had no place in their arguments, no voice in their wages. Not yet. When the words 5 million rolled across the room again, something shifted. Jack's head lifted slightly, the shadows of the bar catching in his eyes. It wasn't greed that flickered there. It was something raw, something closer to hope. Debt piled on his kitchen table, a house falling apart, friends buried overseas, a government that shook his hand one day and forgot him the next. Every weight he carried pressed in, and for once, the sound of money didn't feel like temptation. It felt like survival. He closed his eyes for half a breath, and memory flared. The smell of dust in Kandahar, the pounding of hooves when the army worked horses to patrol villages. He remembered the way animals responded, not to force, but to calm. How even the fiercest could sense fear or faith. Jack's fingers curled tighter around the glass. He was no cowboy, not in the way the men at the bar were, but he knew something about fury, about beasts that carried scars you couldn't see. Leviathan was wild, yes, but so was. But for the first time in years, Jack felt his chest rise with more than weariness. It was resolve, quiet, heavy. A thought took root in him, stubborn as the desert itself. This might be the only way out. The night air outside the bar was cool and dry, carrying the scent of dust and mesquite. Jack Callahan walked the cracked sidewalk, with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket shoulders, hunched against more than just the wind. Amarillo's lights glimmered faintly on the horizon, but his own neighborhood lay further out where the city thinned, into silence. His house waited at the end of a gravel road, a small wooden structure that leaned to one side as though tired of standing. Paint peeled in long strips from the Rajan siding. The porch steps sagged with every creak of his boots. He pushed the door open to a darkness broken only by the dull yellow of a single bulb in the kitchen. On the table lay the evidence of a life unraveling stacks of envelopes with red lettering screaming past due credit. Notices, bank letters warning of foreclosure. Bills were piled like soldiers ready to march him off his last piece of ground. Jack let his keys clatter onto the counter. The silence pressed in, heavy, thicker than the smoke in the bar. War had taught him to live with noise explosions, shouts, gunfire. Silence, however, always seemed the more dangerous enemy. Tonight, it felt like a noose. The door to the back hallway opened, and Maria Callahan stepped out, unfastening, her nurse's badge from her scrub top. 35 years old, hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked exhausted from the night shift at the hospital. Still, her brown eyes sharpened as soon as they settled on her brother, slouched at the table. "Jack," she said softly, almost a sigh, "you're home late." He didn't answer right away. She crossed the room, placing her bag on a chair, noticing the way his shoulders seemed even heavier tonight. She had seen that posture before, after his deployments, after funerals, after another envelope arrived in the mail. Maria had been his anchor since childhood, and after their parents died, she had become his only family. Where Jack carried silence, Maria carried responsibility. She had learned to balance grief with strength, fear with resolve. She was practical to a fault, but her love for her brother was a fire that had never gone out. Now standing in the small kitchen, she sensed it instantly. Something had shifted. Something reckless lived in the silence between them. She braced herself, knowing Jack was about to say something she didn't want to hear. Jack finally lifted his head, the shadows deep under his eyes. "You heard the news, didn't you, about Stanton?" Maria frowned. "What news?" "He's putting up $5 million to anyone who can ride Leviathan for 2 minutes. The words fell flat between them, absurd and heavy. Maria blinked, waiting for the punchline that never came. Then she let out a short, bitter laugh. "You can't be serious," she said. "Jack, that horse is a monster. He's put professional riders in the hospital. Some of the best men in Texas couldn't last 5 seconds. Jack didn't flinch. He spoke with the same calm that unnerved her most. $5 million, Maria. It's enough to wipe the slate clean, enough to keep the bank from taking this house, enough to start over." She shook her head, frustration sparking. "This isn't starting over. This is suicide. Don't tell me you're actually thinking of doing it." The silence that followed was his answer. She dropped her bag onto the floor with a thud. The kitchen felt smaller, air tighter, as though the walls had leaned. It's in to listen. Her voice rose, trembling with anger and fear. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you do this, Jack." He kept his eyes on the stack of bills as though they had more authority than his sister's words. "You survived Iraq. You survived Afghanistan. You came back when so many didn't." Her voice cracked the steel in it, bending under the weight of grief. "Do you know how many nights I prayed just to hear your boots on this floor again? And now you want to risk all that for Stanton's blood money." Jack exhaled slowly, but she pressed on. "I've seen what that horse can do. I've seen men torn up in the ER because of Leviathan. Broken bones, concussions, worse. You think you can do better? You think you're invincible?" Her hands gripped the back of a chair until her knuckles widened. "I can't lose you, Jack. Not after everything. Not after burying mom and dad. Not after watching your friends fold the flag over their coffins. I can't stand in a hospital hallway waiting for someone to tell me you didn't make it this time. Her words filled the room like smoke, choking desperate. The fear was not just of death. It was of Stanton, of a man who turned pain into entertainment and dared the world to clap. Jack sat motionless for a moment, only the ticking of the wall clock filling the silence. Then he leaned back, eyes hollow, but steady. All that I could lose Maria. I already lost over there. He gestured vaguely, as if the desert still clung to his hands. The brothers I fought beside, the years. I can't get back. The pieces of myself that never came home. You want to talk about losing? That's what losing looks like. He tapped the pile of letters on the table. This is just paperwork compared to that. But 5 million, it could change everything. For once, maybe I can take what's left and turn it into something that matters. Maria shook her head, tears brimming. You think I want to do this because I'm reckless? Jack asked, his voice sharpening. No, I want to do it because it's the last chance I see. If I walk away, we lose. This house, this land, everything Dad worked for. If I try and fail, at least I fall, knowing I tried to fix something. If I succeed, maybe the ghosts will finally mean something. His tone was firm, not wild, not delusional, just carved from the same granite that had carried him through war. Maria covered her mouth with her hand, but the sob broke through anyway. She stepped closer, pulling out the chair beside him. Her hand reached across the table, trembling, and she gripped his. If you're set on this, she whispered, then I won't turn my back. I'll hate every second of it, but I'll be there. I'll make sure you don't stand in that arena alone. Jack's eyes softened just for a breath. He squeezed her hand back, the calluses of war, pressing against the softness of her palm. They sat in silence, brother and sister bound, not by agreement, but by blood and loss, by the stubbornness of survival. The night hummed quietly around them and the old house groaning in the wind. For Maria, fear coiled tighter in her chest. For Jack, determination burned steadier in his veins. Together, in that fragile moment, they forged the unspoken truth. Whatever came next, Amarillo's dust would not swallow him alone. Dawn slid over the panhandle like a thin sheet of brass, and Jack drove straight into it. The highway out of Amarillo unspooled in a straight black ribbon, the shoulders littered with tumbleweeds and the carcasses of last year's hopes. On either side, fields lay the color of old bone ranch fences, sagging windmills creaking over stock tanks that held more sky than water. He passed trailers with plywood windows, barns patched with tin, the kind of places where men counted hay bales like coins and prayed the bank would forget their names for one more month. Miles later, the horizon changed. The fences sharpened and stood taller. New. Steel set in concrete posts like teeth. A long lane branched off the highway, paved so smooth Jack could feel the difference through the wheel. At its end, a gate rose out of the prairie, a towering iron arch inset with a polished gold plate that read, Stanton Ranch. Beneath it, cameras watched with glassy eyes, sprinklers ticked in sequenced, arcs across a lawn as green as a promise. Even though a drought starved the county, Jack slowed at the keypad, buzzed and lifted his eyes to the letters stamped in gold. Wealth made its own weather, he thought. Here, even grass obeyed money. He remembered the foreclosed signs he'd seen on the way out, the desperate sale notices. Fertile soil piled into the hands of one man because he could buy it faster than hard seasons could kill it. Bitter heat rose behind his ribs. The gate swung open on silent hydraulics, and he drove in. Inside, it was less a ranch than a principality. A white-pillared mansion sat on a hill, its 2 stories faced in stone, copper gutters gleaming in the pale light. Beyond it, a broad horseshoe of immaculate stables stretched along a landscape drive. A man-made lake mirrored the sky. A pump fed a self-imported waterfall down, and sculpted rock. The air even smelled expensive cedar mulch and new leather, and chlorine from the fountain. Where Jack came from, a windbreak of cottonwoods counted as luxury. Here, luxury had a staff. He parked near an arena that looked like a minor league. Stadium grandstands banked around a sea of raked sand scoreboards, ready LED, rigs stacked like scaffolds for a concert tour. Workers in slate-gray uniforms moved, with factory precision radios clipped to belts, headsets hooked behind ears. No one yelled. Orders traveled by the invisible thread of money. Jack stepped out the sole of his boot, sinking in dust at the edge of all that order. His jacket, the old army green that had become the color of his life, suddenly looked wrong, like a stain on satin. He kept walking. A black SUV rolled up, with a discreet menace of a predator used to feeding. The rear door opened, and Richard Stanton stepped down as if he were setting foot on a private yacht. He was into his 60 seconds, but carried himself like a man who had hired time to be gentle with him. Silver and hair combed clean suit cut to kill a diamond-faced watch throwing sparks across the morning. 2 bodyguards followed in his wake, not large men, but well-trained ones. The kind whose eyes measured each shape in the world and calculated the damage it might do. Stanton's gaze slid over Jack from boots to jawline and lingered, a smile curving, without warmth. "A poor veteran," he said, pitching his voice so it landed on the ears of every worker within range. "Perfect. The crowd will love watching you get thrown." The words cut not because of the insult, but because of the ease of it. Humiliation tossed like small change. Jack let the moment stand. He offered no correction, no excuse. He simply met Stanton's eyes and let the silence say what it always did about men like them. One had learned to be loud, the other had learned to be still. The stillness irritated Stanton more than any answer could have. "Come," Stanton said. "Let's talk." He led Jack into a building that pretended to be a barn, but was really an office in Western costume. Inside, thick rugs drowned the sound of boots. A wall behind a glossy desk held framed photographs of Stanton smiling. Beside senators, governors, a Super Bowl quarterback, 2 movie stars whose names Jack couldn't place. There were also trophies, silver bowls, and bronzed horse heads and plaques etched with words like Vision Excellence Industry, Leadership. It looked less like a rancher's den than a campaign headquarters in camouflage. Stanton took his seat and remained standing in the conversation, a man who viewed sitting as a concession. "So," he said, hands open, benevolent as a banker, "what makes you different from the professionals? They all come, they all fly. They all leave on a stretcher or swearing. Never again. You plan to impress me with a military resume." "I didn't come to impress you," Jack said. Stanton's smile tucked in tighter. "You're not suicidal, I hope, because that's what this island 2 minutes on Leviathan might as well be 2 minutes under a train." "I'm not here to talk," Jack said. "I'm here to ride." The diamond watch flashed as Stanton folded his arms. For a beat, the only sound was the faint hiss of the HVAC. Then he laughed, a short, rehearsed sound that belonged to charity galas and ribbon cootings. "Fine," he said. "Let's see the guest to his quarters." A man stepped out from the wall, as if he'd been waiting there the entire time. Stanton clapped him on the shoulder. "Jack, this is Ethan Crow. He'll take care of you as a very special guest." Ethan was tall enough that his shadow reached the desk. Scar tissue ran from the corner of his brow to the hinge of his jaw, a pale rope over tanned skin. He had the worn bulk of a man who had once been stronger than money, but decided to let money win. Jack had seen his type around rodeo. Shoots, hard, hungry, half in love with pain. Ethan's eyes were the wrong kind of clear. "Welcome to the ranch," Ethan said, voice low. "My advice, soldier, keep your head down, follow instructions, and maybe you walk out. Folks who don't get ground up, same as horses under Leviathan's hooves." The breath he used to say Leviathan carried a warning and a quiet pride. Jack didn't blink. "Show me the stables," he said. They left the office and crossed an inner courtyard, where flagstones gleamed under a surface of water so thin it might have been lacquer. As they walked, Jack cataloged without turning his head 2 cameras above each corner, a third at the gate. Radios, hissing on the belts of 4 men by the far barn. Access roads mapped as surely as supply lines, choke points the same as kill zones. His body moved easily, and his mind moved faster. This was enemy ground, not because of the land, but because of the man who called it his. He hadn't come just to chase money anymore. Looking at the gates and the gold sign, and the careful cruelty of the place, he understood something better. Riding Leviathan here on Stanton's stage would be an act of refusal. The first thing you do with a tyrant is not bow. His resolve clicked into place. "Let's go," he said. Ethan led him down a corridor of stalls that could have doubled as a showroom. The floor was a rubberized mat that swallowed footfalls. On the left and right, horses stood behind half doors with brass latches, their coats glossy as piano lids, manes combed into elegant lines. Heat lamps glowed overhead. Nameplates were engraved, not stamped. Aurelius Sable Dusk, Kingdom Come. Each stall smelled of cedar shavings and liniment, and something like Perfume Wealth's idea of a barn. Grooms watched Jack pass with expressions that mixed curiosity with contempt. One, a broad-shouldered kid, with a too-white smile, leaned on a pitchfork and tossed a remark to his friend, but pitched it for Jack. "Poor man won't last a single breath," he said. Laughter followed like a door closing. Jack didn't answer, didn't even turn. The comment rolled off into the hum of the building. He had no time for men who mistook uniforms for worth. His pulse stayed even as they reached a different door at the end of the hall, closed, bolted, and backed by a framework of steel no interior decorator had tried to hide. The noise came before the sight, a dull, concussive thud like a hammer on a barrel. Then, a deep snort that fogged the air with heat. When Ethan unlatched the final bar and slid the panel back, the sound became a presence. Leviathan's stall was double width, its inner walls sheathed in plate, steel, scarred, and pitted where iron shoes had struck. Heavy timbers on the outside showed black crescent where hooves had landed and splintered wood like kindling. The floor was laid with a grid of rubber and sand torn in two places, where something massive had pawed hard enough to peel it. A chain, hung across the front, not because it would stop the animal, but because it made the people on the other side feel braver. Then the horse turned toward them and swallowed the doorway. Black. Not the soft black of a night sky, but the saturated, lightless color of fresh oil. 1,700 pounds of coiled wire and iron packed into the shape of a stallion whose withers rose over the top rail. His barrels swelled as he drew breath. The ribs didn't show he was too powerful for that. His mane was not combed to silk, but stood half-lifted electric with rage. When he snorted, dust leapt off the straw. His eyes burned, shot through with blood, and every once in a while, the white flashed and the pupils cut narrow, and Jack could feel the storm of it. Leviathan stamped, and the plank behind him rattled. He laid his ears flat and kicked once, a piston blow that rang the steel and made a groom 3 stalls down. Swear under his breath. "Hell's own," someone muttered behind them. "Tomorrow's going to be a show," a cameraman said to his partner as they adjusted the ring light. "There will be blood. Stanton loves blood." A pair of rodeo hands stepped closer, the patches on their jackets loud as NASCAR. One tilted his hat back and grinned at Jack. "Hey, vet, ever ride a Humvee?" he called. "Differ from a horse, in case you're confused. Best write your will," the other added. "We can lend you a pen." Snickers ran along the line of stalls. A boom mic hovered for better audio. Jack's hand didn't clench. He stepped to the rail and let the noise of men slide. Behind him like a curtain, he looked at the animal, and he didn't see a legend or a trophy or a demon. Stanton had summoned from a coal seam. He saw what a man sees when he remembers. Where violence comes from. "You are not evil," he thought. "You are in pain." He didn't say it yet. He watched. War had taught him to read. Bodies. Horses were language in motion if a man knew how to listen. Leviathan threw his head, and the movement was big, but it wasn't free. The left front hoof lifted and set down with a heavy, uneven touch. Not lame, the cadence of his steps didn't break, but guarding a tenderness rode the shoulder. The muscles along his neck bunched too hard too soon, as though he'd learned to carry pain by armoring against hands. That took and took. His breath ran high, not from exertion, but from vigilance, and the rage in his eyes. He'd seen that in men coming off patrols that went bad in Marines who stared too long at empty doorways and flinched at tin slamming on concrete. Rage was sometimes just fear, with a steel helmet. "You're not a monster," Jack said barely, above his breath. "You're hurt." Leviathan shuddered at a fly and slashed in his tail. The red in his eyes was not only fury, it was sleeplessness, stress that calcified into habit. Jack knew that feeling the way a man knows his own limp in the dark. He found himself back in the mountains with the air thin in his lungs and a chestnut mare trembling under him, because gunfire had turned the sky to glass. He remembered the night he sat for hours with a horse that had taken shrapnel from a roadside bomb in its flank. The way the animal's panic eased not when the morphine hit, but when Jack's voice steadied and his hands stopped asking. He spoke softly now, not to soothe the camera crew, not to impress the braggarts, but to aim language into a place that could use it. "Easy," he said, the sound, a low thread that didn't pull. "I see you," a groom snorted. "He don't speak English. He speaks leverage," the other said, "and gravity." "What he speaks is pain," Jack said. The men blinked as if he had said it in a dialect they hadn't learned. At the far end of the aisle, Stanton stood with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man watching a well-rehearsed play hit its marks. He tilted his chin toward Ethan. "You see him," Stanton said far enough away that only those near him would hear. "He's already memorizing the inside of a hospital. Let him look. Tomorrow, he'll be looking up." Ethan's smile cut sideways. "Leviathan threw a 250-pounder last month, a sack he called without looking at Jack. You'll be breakfast." The taunt came easy to him. Jack let it pass. He kept his eyes on the stallion. He did not reach into the stall. He didn't square his shoulders to look bigger or tug his belt to look tougher. He shifted his weight until his body read the way. A quiet horse reads, balanced, rooted, not asking anything except room to breathe. He didn't crowd. He let the chain be the line and gave the animal choice. Leviathan's hammering slowed by a beat. Not enough for the cameras to notice, but enough for a man who had nothing else to watch for. The big head pivoted, nostrils flaring. He drew in Jack's scent, coffee sweat, old leather dust from a different country, and blew it back as a damp, hot gust. His ears pinned flat, seconds before angled forward for a heartbeat, then flicked back to the roar of the barn. The tail swished again, his left foreleg lifted, hovered, set down. He ground the bit against his teeth and shook foam. "Come on," someone said behind Jack. "Move it along." Jack didn't. He stayed breath, slow hands, open eyes, soft but clear. In Afghanistan, he had learned to wait a whole day for a door to open that no one could see. He could spare a minute for Alua, his horse. The stall fell into a different rhythm. Leviathan didn't stop bristling. He was too smart to confuse with a statue. But a thread of attention came across the chain to where Jack stood. The stallion's chest rose and fell like a bellows, but the notes shortened by degrees. Jack did what Sam Whitaker would later tell him had always been the right thing. He listened until he heard. Then it happened, small enough to miss, and huge enough to shake the aisle. Leviathan stopped driving his hindquarters into the back wall. He swung around and faced Jack fully. For one long, bright second, the two held each other's eyes. The horse's lips curled back, flaming, tasting the air where Jack's voice had been. He didn't lunge. He didn't strike. He stood the lightning that lived in him, folded close, and breathed. A murmur traveled the aisle. "Look at that." He spooked him now. "The horse is sizing. Put him up. He'll size him into a stretcher." Jack felt the moment land in him like a stake. The connection thin as thread, real as wire. He didn't smile. He didn't speak again. He just let the moment be the first brick in a road that might hold his. Wait, when the time came to run on it. Stanton drained his coffee and tossed the cup into a bin without looking. "Enough sightseeing," he said. "We've got a show to prepare." Ethan slid the panel closed and dropped the bar back into its saddle. The clang made Leviathan's ears flick. Jack stepped back. The aisle returned to its sales floor, humming moving product from here to their dollars whirring in. Invisible gears. But something in the air had shifted a degree, like wind changing before a storm. And Jack felt it. And so did the horse. Two creatures who knew storms too. Well, not to notice when the pressure dropped. On the walk out, Ethan leaned, close enough that Jack could smell the mint on his breath. "You think silence will save you?" he said. "But tomorrow, when that gate opens, silence won't be worth a dime." Jack's answer was quiet enough not to carry. "Tomorrow," he said, "silence is all that. I will." Outside, sunlight had climbed the mansion to the second story, gilding the copper gutters. Sprinklers hissed water, jeweling the perfect lawn. Somewhere, a generator hummed for the matter. LED banks. Jack turned once more to look at the arena, at the bright seats, waiting for bodies, and the sand waiting for blood. Then he looked past it all, past the gold letters on the gate to the flat horizon that didn't belong to any man, and felt his jaw set. If Stanton's world ran on spectacle, then the only way through would be to refuse it. He breathed in dust and cedar, and the faint living scent of horse. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said to no one in particular, and to one animal in particular, and walked back into the pride. Heat. Jack was escorted back to a guest cabin on the far edge of the ranch property. The building was neat, sterile, too neat to be welcoming, the sort of place designed for containment rather than comfort. Behind it stretched a yard where the stables gave way to fenced paddocks. Jack stepped outside to clear his head. The sun had dropped lower, spilling long shadows across the gravel. In the back corner, stooped over a wheelbarrow, a man was working silently, raking hay into tidy rows. His movements were slow but precise, practiced in the way repetition carved into bone. The man looked up when Jack approached. He was old, well into his 70 seconds, lean as a fence post, but there was a wiry strength in the set of his shoulders. His hands were callous slabs, veins standing out like rope. His eyes, though, lined by years, were sharp and alive, the kind of eyes that saw more than people thought they did. Most of the younger staff ignored him, glancing past him as though he were part of scenery. To them, he was a relic, a man left behind. But Jack noticed the subtle way he moved around the horses grazing nearby, careful, respectful in rhythm with them. The war had trained Jack to spot competence hidden under dust. This man was no relic. "You must be the new fool," the old man said after a moment, voice growly but not unkind. He straightened, leaning on his rake. "Name's Jack Callahan," replied, nodding. "And you are Sam Whitaker," he said. "Used to train horses here. Used to train Leviathan, too, before Stanton decided he knew better." Jack studied him. There was history etched in the way Sam said the stallion's name. "What happened?" Sam sighed, setting the rake aside. "Leviathan wasn't born a monster. He was smart, proud, hell, one of the best I'd ever worked with. But Stanton doesn't want smart, he wants spectacle. Took a good horse and beat the trust out of him. Used whip shocks, every cruel trick in the book until all that was left was rage. Made him into a machine for throwing. Men, not an animal, with a mind of his own. He spat into the dirt. I quit when I saw what was happening. Couldn't stand by. Stanton kept me on doing chores. Figured it was punishment. But I tell you, playing Callahan, that horse ain't mean. He's broken." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He'd known men like that, brothers in. Arms ground down until all they had left was anger, because anger was easier than pain. "You can't ride him the way those cowboys tried," Sam said quietly. "Whips, spurs, rope, they only drive him madder." Sam leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the walls might carry his words back to Stanton. "Listen to me. You don't need to conquer Leviathan. You need to convince him. A horse is a herd animal. He's always looking for a leader he can trust. If he believes you mean him no harm, he'll stand with you. But if he smells fear or force, he'll tear you apart." Jack nodded, listening carefully. "Don't fight him," Sam went on. "Make him believe. That's the only chance you've got." The old man's words sank deep. Jack thought of the desert patrols of the young soldiers he had commanded who followed him. Not because of rank, but because he'd shared their rations, taken the same risks, walked point when it was his turn. Trust was never about shouting orders. It was built in the silence between. Sam must have seen the thought cross his face because he gave a crooked smile. "You've been a leader before. You know what I'm talking about. Remember that Leviathan doesn't need a rider on his back. He needs someone at his side." It was the first real piece of strategy Jack had heard since stepping onto Stanton's land. He filed it away like a soldier, memorizing a map. It wasn't about strength. It was about belief. That night, when the ranch quieted and the floodlights dimmed, Jack slipped out of the cabin. He moved like he had, overseas. Each step, calculated body, low breath, measured. Security guards. They patrolled the grounds, their flashlights cutting beams through the dark. But compared to hostile villages and desert compounds, this was child's play. He skirted the main walk, keeping to the shadows of the stables. The air was thick with hay and dust. Somewhere an owl hooted. Jack reached the reinforced stall at the far end, and the one that housed Leviathan. The corridor was empty. Only the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional thunderous stomp echoed in the stillness. Jack approached slowly, stopping just short of the barred front. Inside, the stallion shifted like a storm, cloud with muscles. His hooves struck the floor in restless bursts. His sides gleamed with sweat even in the cool night air. Every exhale was a blast. Furnace roar. Jack didn't try to open the gate. He didn't shout or gesture. He stood there quietly, letting the horse register his presence. Then he spoke, voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used in the field to calm frightened recruits. "I'm here," he murmured. "No ropes, no whips, just me." Leviathan tossed his head, ears flattening. He struck the ground with a kick that rattled the boards. But Jack didn't move. He kept his body still, his voice calm. "Easy," Jack said softly. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." He spoke in short phrases, steady as a drum beat, his voice low enough that it blended with a hum of the night. Between the words, he whistled a short, sharp note. It was a habit from his army days when they'd trained mounts in the hills overseas. The sound carried a rhythm that animals recognized as consistent, predictable. At first, Leviathan lashed out. He reared against the steel eyes, flashing crimson in the dark. His breath came harsh like a saw cutting wood, but Jack held steady. He didn't step back, didn't raise his arms. He let the stallion rage. And when the fury had burned through a few moments, he spoke again. "You're not alone in this. I know pain. I know what it does." Minutes crawled by. Jack repeated his words, repeating the whistle. Slowly, increment by increment, the pattern began to matter. The giant horse stopped slamming the brass walls quite so hard. His ears twitched forward once curious. Instead of spinning, he paused, turning his massive head toward Jack. It wasn't peace yet, but it was no longer blind anger. The sound, the smell, the tension, it all pulled Jack back to a night years ago in Afghanistan. His unit had commandeered horses to move through a mountain pass where trucks couldn't go. One mayor had taken shrapnel from an IED, panicked in the dark eyes wide with terror. Gunfire echoed through the valley. Jack had dismounted, crouching beside the trembling animal, for hours while the firefight flickered in the distance. He whispered to her, blowing air through his lips, humming a tune, holding her res loose so she didn't feel trapped. Slowly, her panic eased. She lowered her head, leaned into his shoulder. That mayor had carried them all out of the valley alive. Now in the dim stall corridor, he remembered every detail. The same rhythm, the same calm, the same desperate need for trust. He repeated it with Leviathan voice, steady as stone. "You're scared," he whispered. "So was she, so was I. But we survived." Nearly an hour passed. Jack's legs ached from standing, his throat rough from whispering, but he didn't move away. Then finally, Leviathan's stamping slowed. The stallion lifted his head and drew in a long breath. He stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and pressed his muzzle close to the bars. Jack stayed perfectly still. He lowered his gaze, a gesture of respect, and tilted his head slightly, showing he wasn't a threat. Leviathan snorted, the hot air washing over Jack's face. His eyes, still rimmed red, softened for the briefest moment with something that looked like curiosity. The rage hadn't vanished, but it had cracked, revealing something underneath. Jack didn't reach out. He knew better than to push. He just whispered, "Good, that's enough for tonight." The horse blew once more, then backed into the shadows, as if conceding his presence. It wasn't victory, it wasn't even peace, but it was a beginning, a fragile thread, stretched between man and beast. Jack walked away, knowing the bridge had been built, and sometimes the smallest bridges carried the most weight. The morning, after Jack's secret visit to the stable, Richard Stanton arrived with Ethan Crow at his side. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and hay, the polished brass, nameplates gleaming as if they'd been shined for a show. When they reached the far end, the atmosphere was different. Leviathan no longer thundered against the steel walls with blind fury. The stallion still paced ears, flicking back at every sound, but the mad hammering of hooves had lessened. He snorted, tossed his mane, circled the stall in restless vigilance. But there was a strange control in the movement, as though something had shifted inside him. Stanton narrowed his eyes. "He's Keeter." Ethan crossed his arms, suspicious, quieter than he should be. Maybe somebody's been near him. Who's Stanton snapped? The guard swore the place was locked. Ethan glanced toward the guest quarters. That soldier, Callahan. If anyone had the guts to sneak in, it would be him, but I can't prove it. Stanton's jaw tightened. If Leviathan can be tamed, then the spectacle is worthless. The crowd isn't paying to see a pet. They want a monster. He turned on his heel, voice cutting. If he manages to ride Leviathan because the beast has grown soft, this whole event will be a joke. And I do not fund jokes. In his office later that morning, Stanton paced while Ethan waited stiffly by the desk. The diamond on Stanton's watch threw little shards of light across the leather blotter. "I want him vicious," Stanton said. "Savage, a nightmare that tears the ground apart." Ethan shifted uneasily. "There's a way, but it's dangerous." "Then do it." Ethan hesitated. "T40? You know what that does?" "The rodeo. Commissions banned it years ago. It whips a horse into frenzy, but it burns them from the inside. Cardiac failure. Seizures." Stanton cut him off with a snarl. "I don't care if it kills him. I don't care if he drops dead the second the show ends. I need Leviathan rabid. If he walks into that arena docile as a pony, the press will laugh me out of Texas. If he dies, I have dozens more. But if he looks tame, then I lose everything." Ethan clenched his jaw. Defiance flickered for a second, then died. He had followed Stanton too long, buried. Too many doubts. "Fine," he muttered. Stanton's smile was cold. "Good, make the arrangements. I want the injection ready before the final test. Outside, Ethan lit a cigarette with a trembling hand. The smoke curled upward like a confession he would never voice. The one chosen to deliver the drug was Mason Reed, a 28-year-old veterinarian, fresh out of school working temporary jobs to pay off his student loans. He had hoped Stanton Ranch might be a stepping stone prestige experience, maybe a real career. Instead, it had turned into a cage. That afternoon, Ethan found him in the feed storage and pressed a vial into his palm. The liquid shimmered faintly. Yellow. TX40, Ethan said flatly. Stanton's orders. You'll inject it before the event. Mason's eyes widened. This stuff is banned. It can wreck his heart, his lungs. Hell, it could kill him. Then it kills him, Ethan said, stepping closer. The scar on his face catching the light. You'll still do it. I can't. It's illegal. It's unethical. Ethan slammed a hand against the wall, beside Mason's head. Listen, kid, Stanton owns half the veterinary board in this state. If you refuse, you'll never work again. One phone call, and your license is gone. You'll be back in groceries by next month. Do you understand? Mason swallowed hard. His hand shook around the vial. In his mind, Leviathan stopped being a monster and became a patient. An animal trapped, brutalized, and now poisoned by greed. But fear outweighed conviction. He nodded mutely, and Ethan walked away. Clara Hughes arrived at Stanton Ranch with her press badge swinging from a lanyard and her reporter's notebook, tucked under her arm. Officially, she was there to cover the most dangerous wager in Texas history. Unofficially, she was hunting Richard Stanton. For years, she had written exposés about his real estate deals, the foreclosures that fed his empire, the land he swallowed up like a wildfire. Each time his lawyers had buried her under paperwork, each time her editors had backed down. But this event smelled different. The arrogance was too public, the spectacle too large. Somewhere Stanton had slipped, and Clara intended to catch him. Beneath her blazer, hidden in her shoulder bag, was a compact camera rig, battery-charged lens capped. She roamed the ranch like any other reporter, interviewing handlers, taking notes. But in the corridor outside the medical supply room, she overheard voices. Ethan's growl, Mason's stammer, words like TX40 and orders. She edged closer, pressing her phone against the wall to record. Mason's panic was clear, even through the muffled sound. Clara's gut twisted. Stanton wasn't leaving anything to chance. He was manufacturing rage. When the voices moved away, Clara lowered her phone and whispered to herself, "There it is, proof." Her pulse quickened. She needed more, but already the story was forming in her mind. This wasn't just a wager anymore. It was cruelty with a price tag. That night, under the sterile glow of a flood light, Mason stood trembling at Leviathan's stall. In his hand was the syringe filled and capped the liquid inside, catching the light like venom. The horse loomed over him, breath rumbling, eyes, bloodshot but alive. Mason froze. He could almost swear the animal looked at him, not with fury, but with exhausted clarity. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered. His hand shook so hard he nearly dropped. "The syringe. I don't want to do this." Leviathan pawed the ground, a sound like thunder against the steel. Mason squeezed his eyes shut and plunged the needle into the thick neck muscle. The stallion bellowed, rearing back so violently the wall shook. The syringe clattered to the floor empty. Mason stumbled out of the stall chest, heaving, guilt, burning like acid. He pressed his back against the wall, listening to Leviathan roar and slam his hooves into the steel until dust rained from the rafters. His stomach twisted. He had followed orders, but in his mind, he had just betrayed a patient. He walked away with his hands still shaking, the word coward echoing in his skull. Back in her rented motel room, Clara transferred the recording from her phone to her laptop. She replayed it, listening to Stanton's cold command, Ethan's threats, Mason's protests. The words TX40 and make him a monster came through clearly. "This is it," she muttered. The smoking, gun, but she knew better. Stanton's lawyers would tear audio apart, call it hearsay. She needed images, proof no one could deny. The next day, she cornered Mason, near the feed room where the cameras couldn't see. "I know what they made you do," she said, quietly. Mason's face went white. "You don't know anything. I do." She held up her phone. "I have the recording. And I saw your face when you walked out of that stall. Help me, Mason. This isn't just about a horse. This is about exposing Stanton." He shook his head violently. "You don't understand. He'll ruin me. He'll ruin my family. I can protect you, Claire pressed. But if Stanton falls, you'll be free. Do you really want to spend your life cleaning up his messes? Mason hesitated. Fear weared with shame in his eyes. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her told Clara there was a chance. The guilt was already eating him alive. All she had to do was keep pushing. By morning, Stanton Ranch no longer looked like a ranch at all. The arena glowed, under a canopy of floodlights, brighter than a Friday night football game. Rows upon rows of bleachers had been erected around the sand ring, their metal frames shimmering in the heat. By 9, the stands were full, 1,000 voices swelling together into a restless roar. Families came with coolers and flags, ranchers with their hats tipped low, businessmen in pressed suits, and local politicians hungry for a camera angle. Cameramen in neon vests skewered along platforms, adjusting tripods, while drones hovered above their propellers, buzzing like hornets. A regional TV station had set up a broadcast booth, the anchor already warming his voice. Live from Amarillo, where history or disaster is about to unfold. The air carried the smell of dust, popcorn, and anticipation. Yet, it was not the anticipation of sport. It was darker, thicker, the way crowds gathered for a crash, not a race. Every conversation hummed with the same hope that someone would be thrown, that the beast would win, and that blood would stain the sand. Jack Callahan sat in the waiting area, beneath the stands, and the sound of the crowd pulsing through the thin walls like a storm pressing on the windows. Above him, banners rippled in the dry Texas wind, emblazoned with Stanton's name. He exhaled slowly. It didn't feel like a competition. It felt like a public execution. Richard Stanton made his entrance the way a king entered a coronation. He strode across the arena floor in a tailored suit, microphone in hand. His smile sharpened for the cameras. The crowd rose to its feet, clapping, whistling, cheering. Stanton basked in it, lifting one hand. For silence only when he chose. Ladies and gentlemen of Texas, he boomed. Today, you witness the ultimate test. $5 million cash for any rider who can stay on Leviathan for 2 minutes. A wave of applause crashed over the stands. Stanton let it crest before raising a finger. But he continued, If you fail, you will leave this arena not just beaten, not just broken, but disgraced. You will leave Texas itself forbidden to set foot on this land again. For here, failure is shame. The crowd roared even louder, thrilled by the cruelty. Reporters scribbled frantically, their headlines already forming ride or banishment. Up in the press section, Clara Hughes tightened her grip on her camera. She recognized the move instantly. This wasn't a wager, it was a ritual humiliation, a way to grind opponents. Beneath Stanton's heel. Back in the waiting area, Jack sat on a bitted and wooden bench, his pulse heavy in his throat. He heard Stanton's voice echo, and understood what it meant. Not just a test of strength, but a trap designed to destroy him, no matter the outcome. His jaw tightened. He had survived worse. Traps. Before Jack's turn, Stanton unleashed his opening act. 3 of the finest rodeo riders money could buy. Each was announced like a prize fighter, and their credentials rattled off for the cameras. The first was a champion from Oklahoma, muscles taut, belt buckle gleaming. He mounted Leviathan with practice swagger. The gate opened. The stallion erupted. Like a bomb. 7 seconds later, the cowboy lay gasping in the dirt. Arm twisted, pride shattered. The second was a legend nicknamed Iron Rider, famous for taking bulls head-on. He lasted 5 seconds. Leviathan bucked high, twisted midair, and flung him backward over the stall rail. He landed wrong shoulder, snapping audibly. The crowd gasped and then roared approval. The third was a fearless newcomer, young and brash, boasting he could ride 10 untamed broncs in a row. He didn't last long enough to prove it. Leviathan launched him sideways into the fence. Blood sprayed from his nose before he even hit the ground. Medics rushed in, stretchers rolled, but the crowd barely hushed. They were ecstatic, drunk on the spectacle of men broken against the will of Stanton's beast. Leviathan grew wilder with each rider, nostrils flaring, eyes blazing crimson, under the chemical fire of TX-40. Foam streaked his jaws, his man snapped, like a banner in a storm. He pawed at the sand, demanding more, demanding another victim. From the stands, Clara lifted her lens, her gut twisted. The horse wasn't just angry, it was suffering, and every drop of pain was Stanton's doing. The announcer's voice cut through the chaos. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our final challenger, Jack Callahan, a veteran of foreign wars, a man with nothing but grit between him and destiny. The crowd erupted in laughter, boos, whistles. To them, he was a punchline, A pauper among kings. Look at him. One rancher yared, pointing from the stands. A soldier boy, not a rider. He won't last 3 seconds. Better start writing his will, another shouted. Camera lenses swung to capture, in his humiliation. This was the climax. Stanton had orchestrated the fall of a broken veteran against the monster he himself had created. Up in the VIP box, Stanton reclined with a glass of wine smugness, curling his lips. To him, the game was already over. Clara Hughes didn't join the laughter. She steadied her camera, whispering under her breath, "Hold on, Jack. Don't let him own this." Mason Reed sat in the shadows behind the bleachers, his stomach in knots. He knew the poison burning in Leviathan's blood, and he knew what it meant for the man about to face him. Fear and guilt twisted together until he could hardly breathe. All eyes turned toward the tunnel, where Jack would emerge. The hush before the storm tasted of dust and dread. In the cramped locker room beneath the stands, Jack sat alone on a bench, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The muffled roar of the crowd seeped through the walls, a living heartbeat pressing closer. He closed his eyes and summoned the calm that had kept him alive. That in deserts halfway around the world, he thought of Sam Whitaker's weathered face, the old man's words still ringing. Don't try to break him, make him. Believe. He thought of Afghanistan of nights when the only thing between life and death was a steady hand and a quiet voice. He remembered the mayor that had carried him out of a kill zone, trembling but trusting. He heard Maria's voice too, not in the room, but inside him. You survived the war. Don't let a horse finish what it couldn't. Jack drew in a slow breath, opened his eyes, and whispered to himself, "This time, it's not about dying, it's about living again." He stood, shoulders squared, spine straight. His heartbeat was still racing, but it no longer felt like fear. It felt like readiness. The iron gates creaked open, and Jack Callahan walked out into the glare of Stanton's arena. He wore no sponsor's colors, no embroidered chaps, no gleaming boots, just the faded remnants of an army jacket. One shoulder frayed where shrapnel had torn it years ago, and boots worn thin at the heel. Dust clung to him like a second skin. He looked less like a rodeo rider than a drifter who had wandered into the wrong story. The crowd saw it instantly and roared with laughter. "Look at him. He's a bum, not a cowboy." Someone jeered. Another voice rang out. "He won't last 3 seconds." In the VIP box, Stanton smiled, thinly. The poorer the veteran looked, and the bigger the spectacle when he fell. Clara Hughes swung her camera into focus, the lens locking onto the lone figure crossing the sand. She whispered to herself, "David against Goliath," and pressed record. Jack didn't react to the insults. He kept his eyes forward locked, not on the crowd, not on Stanton, but on the stall, at the far end of the ring. Behind the gates, Leviathan pawed and snorted a thunderstorm caged in steel. Jack walked with steady steps, not like a man marching to slaughter, but like a man preparing for a conversation long overdue. When the chute burst open, Leviathan exploded into the arena. His scream shook the rafters, a sound like thunder tearing itself in half. The stallion's muscles bunched and snapped. Every vein raised his eyes red as coals. The TX-40 pulsed through his blood, burning away thought and amplifying pain until it twisted into fury. He struck the sand with his front hooves, hurling grit into the first row. Spectators leapt to their feet, hollering with manic joy. "He'll crush him, watch him die." Jack swung himself onto the horse's back in one clean motion, settling into the saddle with no hesitation. His hands took the reins lightly, fingers relaxed as if he were resting them on a friend's shoulder. Leviathan reared hind legs, kicking skywards, then slammed forward with the force of a wrecking ball. The saddle snapped against Jack's spine, but he clung with a body that moved like water instead of iron. Each violent jolt should have unseated him. Instead, he absorbed them chest low, breath steady, as if he had been waiting for this chaos all his life. The crowd howled. They had come for blood. What they saw was something stranger, a rider who refused to fight back. Jack pressed himself close to Leviathan's neck, his breath in rhythm, as with the horse's heaving lungs. He whispered into the cyclone of noise. "I know you heard he said the words too soft for anyone but the stallion to hear. So do I." Each phrase came out on the exhale, timed with the animal's labored breaths. Jack didn't grip tighter, didn't yank on the res. He let his body move with emotion, rolling with the jolts like a soldier yielding to the recoil of a rifle. Memories flickered, a battlefield, hospital tent where screams pierced canvas walls, A friend's blood soaking the dirt while mortars fell. The helplessness, the rage. He had carried it all back with Cora. Him, now pressed against Leviathan's thrashing body. He felt the same raw wound pulsing in another creature. The stallion bucked, twisted, slammed against the rail. Jack went with him, not against him. "I know," he murmured. "I know what they did to you. I've been used too." Gradually, the noise from the stands shifted. The laughter thinned. People leaned forward, frowning. They had never seen a rider who didn't battle the beast with brute force, who simply endured and spoke as though the horse could answer. Silence, tentative and strange, began to creep into the thunder. Most riders would have dug in their heels, hauled hard on the reins, tried to break the stallion's spirit with iron and leather. Jack did the opposite. Half a minute into the chaos, he loosened his grip. The reins slipped slack, dangling. Gasps ran through the stands. "He's lost control," someone shouted. But Jack hadn't lost control. He was offering it. His body stayed balanced, moving as part of the horse, his legs steady, his hands open. He gave Leviathan the space no one else had ever given. The stallion surged into a mad gallop, circling the arena with sand, spraying like bullets. Jack leaned with him, not steering, not resisting. For the first time in years, Leviathan wasn't pulling against iron. He was running free inside the cage. Yes, but free enough to feel it. In the press row, Clara's voice cracked with awe. "He's letting the horse choose," she whispered. Beside her, Mason Reed shook his head in disbelief. "He's not riding it," he said slowly. "He's listening to it." Leviathan's strides thundered each hoofbeat, shaking the stands. But something subtle had changed. The frenzy was no longer blind rage. There was rhythm creeping into the storm, a question forming in the stallion's eyes. "What are you? Why aren't you hurting me?" A minute passed, and then more. The second stretched like wire. Leviathan's violence slowed, not stopped, but tempered. His bucking gave way to circling runs, his eyes still wild, but less desperate. Foam flecked his jaws, but the madness began to dim. Jack's voice did not falter. "You're not alone," he whispered, breath and steady. "Despite the pounding, I was thrown into a war I didn't choose. They used me, left me, just like they used you." He wasn't only speaking to the war, he was confessing to himself, bleeding out truths he had never voiced. The pain of survival, the guilt of living when others had not, the rage at being discarded, broken, forgotten. Leviathan's ears twitched back at the sound. His sides heaped, his gait steadied. In the stands, silence thickened. The jeers had died. Even the children clutched the rails without a word. The arena held its breath, hypnotized by the sight of a man speaking, not to dominate, but to connect. Every camera lens tightened. Every reporter scribbled furiously, unsure how to describe what they were witnessing. Then it happened. Leviathan mid-stride slowed. His breath came ragged. He shook his great head, snorting, and then, impossibly, he dropped to his knees. A hush fell over. Thousands. The stallion bowed down 4 legs, folding muzzle, nearly touching the sand. His body shuddered, sweat pouring, but he did not throw the rider. Jack remained still. He did not thrust his fists into the air. He did not shout, "Victory!" He placed a single hand on the horse's mane and whispered, "You've chosen. Thank you." For a long electric heartbeat, the world stopped. Then the silence cracked. Applause broke like a dam. Cheers. Screams, hats flying skyward. People stomped the bleachers so hard the steel rattled. Some cried openly, wiping their eyes with sleeves. Others clutched their neighbors, shouting words they couldn't hear over. The roar. They had expected blood. They had seen a miracle instead. Not domination, but trust. Not conquest, but surrender. Freely given. Leviathan had not been broken. He had bowed. The arena erupted into chaos hats, thrown the Voix horse from screaming. Cameramen scrambled to capture every second, knowing history was unfolding before their lenses. Clara Hughes held her camera steady, her own hands trembling. "I've got it," she whispered. "Every second of it." In the VIP box, Stanton rose so fast his chair toppled. His wine glass slipped, shattering on the floor. His face drained white. "No," he muttered. "No. It's impossible." Ethan Crow glanced at him uneasy. This was not the triumph they had scripted. This was a catastrophe broadcast live. Below them, in the center of the arena, a battered veteran sat astride a kneeling giant, and the world cheered. Not for Stanton's empire, but for a bond he had tried to destroy. The arena was still trembling with cheers when Clara Hughes rose from the press benches. Her heart pounded, but her voice came out clear as she lifted a handheld microphone borrowed from the news crew beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called, her words cutting into the roar. "You deserve to know the truth behind what you just witnessed." The crowd stilled murmurs of curiosity, replacing the cheers. Clara connected her hidden camera rig to the arena's massive video screens. For the moment, static flickered. Then the footage appeared. On the giant screen, the audience saw Richard Stanton's own face lips curling with arrogance as he barked to Ethan. "Crow, give him TX40, I want a monster." The video continued, Ethan shoving a trembling young veterinarian against a wall, forcing the syringe into his prive. "Hands?" Mason Reed's voice cracked with protest. "It could kill him." And then on screen, Leviathan bucked as the needle pierced his neck. The arena fell into dead silence. Then a wave of outrage broke loose. "Animal abuse," someone screamed. "He lied to all of Texas," another shouted. Banners waved, fists shook. People booed, not at the horse, not at the riders, but at Stanton. The miracle they had just seen twisted into a horror once. They realized what had been done to Leviathan. Stanton's smug smile dissolved. He glanced at Ethan, who clenched his fists, jaw set, eyes darting to the exits. Clara kept the camera trained forward, her pulse racing. The truth was no longer buried. It was 10 feet high on a rye, screened for all of Texas to see. Chaos rippled through the stands. Reporters leapt to their feet, cameras flashing microphones, raised voices clashing as they shouted questions. Social media feeds exploded. Live streams carried Clara's footage beyond Amarillo within minutes. Phones everywhere lit up with the hashtag already spreading justice for Leviathan. "What kind of man drugs his own horse for spectacle?" cried one anchor live on air. Crowds who had cheered for Stanton minutes ago now turned on him, veins bulging in fury. Men who had once shaken his hand now called him a fraud. Women covered their children's ears from the curses hurled toward the VIP box. Down in the press row, Clara didn't lower her camera. She kept filming everything: the rage, the shock, the betrayal. This was the story she had chased for years. Now, the people weren't just listening. They were screaming with her. In the lower stands, Maria Callahan wiped tears from her cheeks. She had prayed her brother would live through the ride. Now, she watched the truth blaze across the giant screens. Pride swelled in her chest, cutting through the fear. Out in the ring, Leviathan stood trembling, sweat streaking his flanks, sides heaving like bellows. His very body was proof of Stanton's cruelty. Each breath he took was testimony against the empire that had tried to turn him into a weapon. A sharp whistle pierced the uproar. At the arena's entrance, uniformed deputies pushed through, followed by officers from the Texas Animal Welfare Division. Their badges glinted beneath the stadium. "Lights! Clear a path!" barked the sheriff of Potter County. The crowd surged back, voices rising as cameras pivoted to capture the new development. Clara felt her chest lift. She had tipped them off early that morning, praying the footage would be enough to crawl, trigger action. Now the cavalry had arrived. The sheriff strode to the VIP box, his voice booming over the loudspeaker. "Richard Stanton, you are under arrest for animal cruelty, fraud, and obstruction of investigation." Gasps erupted. Stanton stood frozen, then spat. "You fools. Do you know who I am? I own this land, this county. I feed half the minute of and state." 2 deputies moved in, and Ethan Crow tried to slip away toward the service tunnel, but 3 officers caught him before he made it 5 steps. He struggled swinging once, but they slammed him against the rail and clamped the cuffs. On the arena floor, Mason Reed trembled, but when the sheriff's eyes found him, the young vet nodded firmly. "I'll testify," he said loud, enough for the microphones to catch. "Every word in that video is true." The stands erupted again, but this time with approval. "Cuff him!" voices shouted. "He's not above the law." Stanton's face burned crimson as deputies pulled his arms behind him. He struggled, shouting at the cameras. "This is a joke. You can't do this to me. I am Richard Stanton." Spit flew from his lips. "A broke veteran cannot defeat me. I have money. I have power. I own you all." The cameras caught every second. The big screens magnified his twisted features to the entire crowd. Across Texas, televisions broadcast the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable. In the VIP section, local officials who had sat proudly beside Stanton slid out quietly, eyes averted, abandoning him as quickly as they had once praised him. No one rushed to defend him. In the arena, Leviathan threw his head back and loosed a thunderous roar, a sound so deep it rattled the seats. To the crowd, it was not a horse's call, but a verdict, a final punctuation. Stanton's reign ended not with applause, but with a cry of the very beast he had tried to enslave. As deputies dragged Stanton toward the exit, the disgraced man twisted veins bulging in his neck. "You haven't won." "Callahan!" he shrieked. "You'll never win against me!" Jack still satisfied. Leviathan, the stallion's body trembling, beneath him, but calm enough to hold steady. Jack raised his voice, gravel rough, yet carrying through the speakers wired into the arena. "It wasn't me who defeated you, Stanton," he said. His words echoed in the hush that followed. It was the horse who chose to trust. The arena froze in silence. Then, as if a fuse had burned down to its last inch, it erupted cheers, stomping hats, flying skyward. Reporters scrambled to capture the line, already typing it into headlines. Maria burst onto the sand, sprinting past handlers and threw her arms around her brother's waist. Jack leaned down, hugging her tightly with one arm while the other steadied Leviathan. Clara approached from the sidelines, tears brimming as she whispered, "That sentence, Jack? It's going to shake this country." Jack didn't answer. He stroked Leviathan's neck, feeling the tremors still rippling through the animal's massive frame. All he wanted was to reassure the creature that had carried him through the storm. By nightfall, the story had already hardened into legend. Networks across the nation replayed the footage, dubbing it the day Leviathan chose trust. Hashtags, sword articles, spread like wildfire, and Clara's name appeared on national broadcasts as the reporter who had broken Stanton's empire. In the arena, Clara conducted a short interview, her microphone trembling as she asked Jack how he had done it. "I didn't tame him," Jack replied simply. "I listened." Mason Reed stepped forward. At last, shoulders squared. "I will testify against Stanton," he declared, voice steady. "This horse deserves justice." For the first time all day, he felt taller. Animal welfare officers led Leviathan gently from the arena to a waiting trailer bound for a rehabilitation ranch. Jack walked alongside, murmuring low to calm him, hand resting on the damp neck. The crowd parted for them as though escorting royalty. That night, Amarillo's streets filled, with people waving flags, chanting Jack's name, carrying homemade banners that read, "Honor, not cruelty." A parade formed spontaneously, horns, blaring voices carrying through the Texas night. But inside Jack's chest, it didn't feel like glory. It felt like release. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying a burden alone. He and the horse had survived, and survival itself was victory enough. In the days following Stanton's arrest, Amarillo felt as if it had woken from a bad dream to find the sun already high. The radio hosts who had once given Stanton free airtime now parsed court filings and ethics codes. The regional TV station replayed the kneeling a dozen times a day, then cut to Clara's footage of the injection and the threats, and the moment the story turned from spectacle to reckoning. And somewhere between headline and hush, a practical question surfaced. The wager had been made in public broadcast across Texas, witnessed by thousands. Whether or not the man who made it would go free, the organizers were on the hook. They convened a press event on the arena floor 3 days later. The bleachers were half full, mostly locals and reporters who had not yet packed their vans, a scattering of ranch hands from out of town who wanted to see the finale. A folding table had been set near the center rail. On it lay a plain envelope and a check large enough for television. The inked figure, a row of zeros that seemed almost comic in the dusty light. Jack stood with his hands in his pockets, wearing a clean shirt, only because Maria had insisted. He looked taller than he had the night of the ride, though perhaps it was only the way. His shoulders had loosened. Maria stood a step behind him, hand on his elbow, and Sam Whitaker was there too, hat held against his chest, the brim stained, dark by old sweat. A deputy from the sheriff's office read a short statement about contracts and public declarations about the state's interest in preventing fraud. Then the man representing the event committee cleared his throat and pushed the envelope toward Jack. "Mr. Callahan," he said, trying for dignity as agreed $5 million. Cameras clicked from the stands. A boy cheered and then went shy as everyone turned to look at him. Jack took the envelope and set it on the table, palms flat. He glanced at Maria. She wiped her eyes and nodded. He looked at Sam. The old trainer's chin trembled once, almost imperceptibly. Then Jack faced the microphones. "I know what most people expect," he said. "Pay the bank, put a fence around, a piece of land, and live easy. His voice was steady, the gravel of it, softened by the open air. But I didn't stay on that horse to live easy. He took a breath. I'm using most of this money to start a rescue ranch with Sam Whitaker and my sister Maria. A place for horses like Leviathan. A place that doesn't break what's hurting. We'll call it Hope Ranch Sanctuary. For a heartbeat, the arena was as quiet as it had been when the stallion first bowed. Then the sound rose like weather applause, whistles people on their feet. A woman shouted, "God bless you, son." And someone else yelled, "That's what a real man does," Maria cried, without looking away from her brother. Sam put his hat back on and said, voice thick, "You didn't just save one horse, Jack. You gave the next ones a chance to live." Leviathan's transfer took place at dawn under a pale strip of sky that had not yet decided to be blue. Animal welfare officers supervised the calm and professional, their voices low. The stallion watched the trailer with rolling eyes and flared nostrils, front hooves, stamping dirt into a steady drum. No one hurried him. Jack stood to one side, speaking now and then in that quiet rhythm he had used in the arena, phrases more breath than sound, a cadence of reassurance. The new ranch lay west of town, 40 acres of hard pen and grass stubble stitched, together with a modest house and a barn that had seen better years. Maria had scrubbed the little clinic room until the paint peeled under her hands. Sam had inspected every fence post, replacing the rotten ones himself. Jack had slept in the tack room for 2 nights, then remembered he owned a bed and moved into the house, where he sat on the floor and assembled metal shelving for feed with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb. When the trailer gate swung open, the stallion hesitated, head-high, body tense. He did not see steel bars or concrete walls. He saw a long corral with a roofed shelter, a pasture running down to a thin line of cottonwoods, and beyond that open range, he stepped down slowly, one hoof, then another, listening to the sound his weight made on this new ground. The first snort was a warning, the second an uncertain question. He had spent months in a fortress built to show him his own rage. Here, the walls had been replaced by distance. The first days were rough. He pinned his ears at every handler, lashed out when a bird startled in the grass, whirled at the crack of a nail gun 2 fields over. Sometimes, in the heat afternoons, he stood rigid in the shade, with sweat darkening his coat, though there was no work to do. Memory is a kind of labor. At night he circled the shelter until the bedding was a cloud of dust, and finally slept standing head-low, ribs moving like bellows. But each morning, when Jack came to the fence with a halter, he did not lift a voice. He did not raise. The stallion's breathing eased. The whites of his eyes showed less, his ears no longer locked to the sound of threat, oriented back toward the man's words. "Easy," Jack would murmur. "I'm here." After a week, Leviathan took an apple from Jack's palm and did not crush the man's fingers when he closed his teeth. After 2 weeks, he lowered his head for a soft brush. After 3, he stood still, while Maria, quick and gentle, cleaned and dressed. An old fetlock wounded her talk, a soothing nonsense about the weather and the price of hay. One evening, he walked beside Jack along the fence line without a lead rope, pausing where the pasture opened and the sky lifted. That was the first night he slept lying down. He became the ranch's first resident, and its emblem, the great black horse, who had knelt, then stood again. Clara's article ran on a Sunday, the kind of day when coffee tastes better and people have time to read slowly. The Dallas Morning News put it above the fold, a photograph of the stallion mid-kneel beside the headline, "The Veteran and the Giant Horse When Trust Beat Violence." The story braided the ride with the arrest and the months of reporting that had made the arrest possible. It detailed Stanton's playbook, the zoning favors, the hush contracts, the way cruelty could masquerade as tradition. It also described, without embroidery, the moment a man put down the rience. The piece spread in a way that felt less like virality than recognition. Veterans wrote to Clara from Kentucky tobacco farms in California suburbs. Horse people wrote from places with names that sounded like lullabibis. One email came from a woman in El Paso, who said she had never believed a horse could choose. Now she wasn't sure why she hadn't. National outlets picked it up. A morning show put Clara on air, and she used her minutes to talk about evidence, animals, and men who come home from war and find the war has followed them into the kitchen. They put Jack on the line, too. He said he had nothing to sell but hay and a way of listening. And the host laughed softly, the way people laugh when they feel their throat catch. Veterans organizations reached out, not just the big names with glossy brochures, but grassroots groups that met in borrowed rooms over bad coffee. They asked Jack if he would consider hosting small retreats, quiet weekends where former soldiers could learn the patience of horses and the habit of breath. PTSD doesn't listen to lectures, one man told him on the phone. Sometimes it listens to hoof-be-a-tats. Jack told them to come. They named it Hope Ranch. Sanctuary because a thing should be called what you want it to become. The sign out front was rough cedar, hand-carved by a neighbor who turned wood better than he tended his cattle. A painted silhouette of Leviathan arched across it, not wild-eyed and raging, but poised mid-stride head, slightly lowered in attention. At first, the corrals were almost empty. Then the calls started to arrive. A mare left in a foreclosure. Field with a hip bone like a blade. A pale colt with barbed wire scars. A sorrow gelding whose knees had swollen from running circles for tourists. Some came from owners ashamed of what they had allowed. Some from neighbors who could not look away. Some from officers who had seen too many things they could not unsee. Sam built a small crew out of kids who were good with their hands and hungry to learn. He taught them more about patience than pressure, how to wait for a blink before you ask for a step, how to recognize the difference between stubborn and scared. Make them trust you, he'd say, tapping his heart, not your rope. He moved slower than he used to, stiff in the mornings, but when he stepped into a brown pen and the years fell away, and the horse looked at him as if the old man were a wind he had always known. Maria turned the old feed room into a clinic with bright light and a floor that could be bleached without complaint. She drafted protocols, logged injections, read late at night about tendon sheets and nutrition for underweight rescues. She taught volunteers to read a thermometer like a language. Her hands knew when to be firm and when to tremble. They often trembled after the horses were asleep. Jack became the person people called when shame was heavier than fate. He went to auction lots and county fairs, sour-smelling barns and backyards where the grass was too high. He learned to translate panic into plans and grief into hay deliveries. On the weekends, small groups of veterans came to sit on the fence rail and watch horses eat a therapy more ancient than any manual. In time, they led the gentlest ones on short walks, then groomed them, then spoke out loud to no one in particular. The ranch did not make promises it could not keep. It offered the work of ordinary kindness in the space in which to accept it. Leviathan changed in ways that were not flashy. He learned that the clatter of a wheelbarrow was not a blow. He learned that a halter can mean pasture, not pain. The day he let a child touch the white star on his forehead and stood without moving until the child drew back on her own, that was the day Sam took off his hat and whispered thanks to no one in particular. By late summer, the front pasture had greened to generosity the panhandle gives and then takes back. The fence line hummed with insects, and the barn swallows stitched the air with blue. Jack walked out at dusk and leaned on the top rail. Leviathan grazed near the cottonwoods, his coat catching the last of the light water. When the stallion lifted his head and saw the man, he came forward at a measured walk. No rush, no wary side-up. He stopped close enough that Jack could feel the warmth of his breath. Jack reached to touch the thick neck and spoke in the tone he had used when everything was noise. "We're both survivors," he said barely above a fey breath. "Now we start again." Leviathan exhaled a low sound like agreement. It then tipped his forehead into Jack's shoulder with the weight of a vow. Maria laughed softly from the barn door where she stood with a bucket, and Sam hammered a last nail into a new length of fence and called out that the corner would hold through winter. The camera in Clara's hands. She had come for a quiet visit, not a story panned back on instinct. The pasture widened in the frame. The old barn squared itself against the horizon. The Texas sky lifted like a curtain. It didn't look like an ending. It looked like a threshold. Years ran, their steady track. The sanctuary filled, then emptied, then filled again in the sorting rhythm of rescue. Some horses adopted out to families who sent Christmas cards with children and manes braided red. Some staying for good because their scars weren't the kind you could see. The community learned the road to Hope Ranch, learned the smell of it, hay and mineral dust and coffee heating on the clinic hot plate. Schools requested field trips. Ranchers who had once scoffed at the idea of soft training sent their nephews to volunteer for a summer and found the boys quieter by September. Programs for veterans grew from weekend drop-ins to structured retreats. Jack never pretended expertise he didn't have. He let other people teach breathing and sleep hygiene while he showed men how to stand beside a 1,000-pound animal without bracing. He told them the story not of a miracle, but of a practice, Loosen the res, keep your seats, speak low, let the other being choose to meet you halfway. In exit surveys, no one turned in men, wrote in the margins. I remembered what it felt like to be trusted. A nonprofit helped fund cabins under the cottonwoods. A woman from Fort Hood donated a round pen, saying her brother had found his footing again in that dirt. Clara came back often, sometimes with a camera, sometimes with groceries. Her big story had made her a name in rooms that always had a pot of coffee. But she kept writing small stories too, about a black cult born on a night of lightning. About Maria's 5th grade, volunteers proudly mastering the art of wrapping a leg. Mason Reed testified, when the court called, and then joined the sanctuary, 2 afternoons a week, smiling shilly when Maria told him his suture lines were better than hers. Sam aged the way oak does, slower than you think, and then all at once. But he still walked out to the pastures at dawn and said hello to every horse by name. Leviathan grew into the space he had been given. The muscles that had once been carved for violence softened into the kind of strength that lasts. Children who had seen only pictures of him kneeling learned to balance bareback on his broad spine while he stood in the shade and listened to their jokes. He still had days when his breath came quick and his head lifted at a sound. Trauma does not negotiate once and leave forever. On those days, Jack slowed down with him, and they stood together until the wind changed. There is a kind of fame that sticks, the kind that turns to folk's story when no one is looking. Leviathan had that. He was the reason a county fair added a presentation about humane training. He was the reason a hard man stopped himself from bringing a whip where it wasn't needed. He was the silhouette, painted on a sign that made drivers tap their brakes and look twice at their maps, wondering if they could spare half an hour to see the horse who had taught a veteran to put down the res. The autumn Leviathan slowed for good, arrived with a cleaned light and air that tasted like the first bite of an apple. His coat had taken on the dull sheen of age. The scar above his left fetlock pulled a little when he walked. He ate well until he didn't. The day his breath misted heavily in the mild air, and he stood for a long time with his eyes half closed. Maria knelt beside him and pressed her cheek to his shoulder. "I know," she said. "We hear you." Jack slept in the barn that night. Old habits came back, unbidden. Watch schedules, vigilance, a hand laid on a living thing at intervals, to be sure the living thing was still there. With dawn, he walked Leviathan into the cottonwoods and stood with him beneath the tree, where the leaves went gold so. Early, they seemed to keep a private calendar. The stallion lowered himself, carefully, and rested with his legs tucked head up, ears flicking at the birds that threw gossip back and forth, across the pasture. Sam came and sat on an overturned bucket hat in his lap. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said only, "You did. Good, old boy," as if the horse were a man who needed to hear it. There are deaths that break things and deaths that finish songs already beautiful. Leviathan's was the second. He laid his head against Jack's knee and exhaled, and the last breath was no different from the one before, except that no others came after it. Jack did not stand for a while. He put his hand on the horse's neck and waited until his own breathing was steady again. He laid a hand on Leviathan's neck and waited until his own breath steadied. By sunset, they buried the great stallion beneath the cottonwood where Jack had once learned a new kind of standing. The town came without being called, carrying flowers awkward in their hands, apples they could not bear to waste, drawings from children pressed into Maria's palms. Sam hammered a marker into the soil. Leviathan. No titles, no victories, just a name, and the years that framed his life. Clara lifted her camera, snapped a final picture, and lowered it with tears she didn't hide. It was as if the horse had spoken to her in a language she had always known, but forgotten until now. That night, Jack sat by the mound as darkness fell uninvited. Horses shifted in the paddocks. From the bunkhouse drifted the laughter of volunteers and the faint static of a radio singing about highways. He thought of 1,000 small moments the apple stolen without fear, the halter that once meant freedom, the rhythm of two beings breathing as one in an arena filled with hunger for spectacle. "Thank you," he whispered when the stars appeared. Not for the ride, nor the money, nor the stories others would tell, but for the permission to begin again. Years passed. The sanctuary grew. Fences were rebuilt, barns raised, wounds healed. Sam's students carried his lessons into their own barns. Veterans returned with families, pointing to the cottonwood as if it were holy ground. The Hope Ranch logo, Leviathan Midstride, traveled on t-shirts, plaques, and borrowed trailers. Jack told the story only one way, the shortest version. A horse chose to trust, and he taught me how to be worthy of it. The rest, headlines, courts, viral feeds, belonged to a world outside these fences. Inside, there was only the quiet, ordinary work of keeping living things alive. On autumn evenings, when light fell just so, shadows stretched across the pasture into the shape of a great horse bowing. Children would shout, Maria would smile, Jack would tip his hat, not because shadows see, but because rituals remind us who we are. What began as a wager ended as a sanctuary. What began as a spectacle ended as salvation. And yet, on a storm-lit night years later, Sam swore he heard hoofbeats pounding the earth near the cottonwood, wild and defiant. He ran outside, but the pasture was empty. Only wind through the trees. Still, the ground trembled under his boots, as if Leviathan had risen for one last gallop, reminding them all, trust, once given, never truly dies.